We present episode 4 of Cottoning On by Geoffrey Banks, read by Nigel Banks. In this episode, we learn about young Geoffrey's successful interview to get into Bolton School, the influence of a charismatic teacher there, and the arrival of his young sister Sheila.
Back in the interview room at Bolton School, the other examiner spoke up. Now the lights had been switched on, I could see her properly. I was looking, had I but known it, at Emma Saxelby, the teacher who was to get me into Cambridge. Put that way, it sounds like the dodge used by little lads who wanted to watch Bolton Wanderers without paying. "Hey, mister," they would mutter to some adult as he approached the turnstile. "Wilt get us in under the coat?" It was perfectly true that Emma got us into Cambridge, but at the time of this interview, I hadn't even heard of the place, and she was just another female teacher. Except that she was wearing an academic gown. None of my previous teachers had pulled that one. In fact, the only gown I'd set eyes on was the one worn by our congregational minister, Reverend Hough, who, according to my mother, was a lovely man. But he had a very limp handshake, and his sermons always bored the pants off you, which was no joke either, sitting in that rock-hard pew. Still, Mum was right. He was a very kind man. He once put me up at the manse for a whole school term, so my sister could have her scarlet fever at home. Reverend Hough wore a gown, but then he came from the Isle of Man. Looking at Emma Saxelby, it wasn't only the gown that struck you. Her eyes were remarkable. At the age of 10, you didn't associate teachers with human attributes. Not even when they handed you a gold star. All the same, the 3 pairs of eyes which had inspected me that day had all, in the limited period of an interview, made real contact. They'd impressed me, so that afterwards, it wasn't so much the sandstone, the cloisters, and the parquet floors that stayed in the front of my mind, as the 3 people. And what was it about this woman's voice? The ones I was accustomed to operated on a pretty narrow wave band, but hers seemed to have press-ganged every note on the tonic scale. Not only that, she ripped off sentences faster than anyone I'd ever heard. There was a touch of the machine gun about her. So how the blazes did she manage that sing-song intonation at the same time? Even if it had been explained to me that she was rattling away in an educated Irish accent, it would have cut no ice with me. As far as I was concerned, there were only 4 ways of speaking. First, there was Lancashire number 1, as practiced by parents, relatives, neighbours, and teachers at Church Road. Then came Lancashire number 2, which I slid into so comfortably in the playground and back Raymond Street that I needed jolting out of it at home when I forgot. My father once appeared at my bedroom door in pyjama bottoms and shaving soap when I called my broken shoelace a monkey sod. Category number 3 was the special, for people on the wireless. E.P. Smith, the headmaster, his colleague A.D. Walsh. Finally, there was a separate subcategory for my cousin Kathleen, who had been operated on for elocution and now talked posh. She called my mother Auntie. But you couldn't fit Emma Saxelby into any of these. I sensed she would take a lot of keeping up with. The room where we were then sitting was her own personal staff room, because she was the only female teacher in the school, which could have been daunting for her in the 1920s when she first arrived. And on top of that, she was head of modern languages. Operating in a Lancastrian grammar school of only 300 boys, she had an amazing track record. Year after year, 1 or more of her sixth formers landed an open scholarship to Oxford or Cambridge. At one Cambridge college alone, her long list of successful candidates prompted a colleague to remark bitchily, "Emmanuel? There is some corner of a foreign field that is forever Bolton." You certainly didn't sidle up to Emma and mutter, "Wilt get us into Cambridge under thee gown?" It was the other way round. She told you. She did very little teaching below the sixth form, and I hadn't even exchanged a word with her since my interview, when suddenly, 3 years later, there she was, beaming at me on the corridor. I was 13. "Ah, Banks," she said, "your teacher tells me you're doing really promising work in French. So just strive you hard to get a distinction in your matric and then come to me in the sixth form and we'll set about getting you into Cambridge." The other heads of department were indignant at this annual recruiting of hers and took their complaints to the top. But Emma went in no fear of the headmaster. She fought her corner with Irish pugnacity. Her conscience was clear. Couldn't these idiots grasp the fact that languages were the key to peace and international understanding? Especially French? Sure, didn't the French supply the very words entente cordiale? Since it was far too difficult in those days for educated men to kick a woman in the teeth, Emma went on lobbying junior talent, and her frustrated colleagues were left sniping from the sidelines. Especially the senior science man, who regularly pointed out to future linguists that they would be spending the best years of their lives acquiring one of the minor skills of any continental waiter. Emma seemed not to have twigged that the French also supplied the term double entendre. Every day she ventured unblinking into the minefield of our teenage bawdy-mindedness. "Banks," she would say as she handed me back my latest effort at translation, "you're developing a splendid feel for a passage." Not all the members of the form had the knack of the soundless guffaw, especially not two of them. At such moments, you could rely on one or other of them to crack up, and on a good day, both. At the end of the corridor, there was a walk-in cupboard, which Emma had commandeered as a store for her vast collection of reference books. She had an unnerving habit of referring to it as her wee dark hole. "Banks," she said once, "go you along to my wee dark hole, would you not, and ferret about there till you find Larousse." There's something about a huge snort of laughter bursting out before the startled victim can even think about control. Really life-enhancing. But the impressive thing was the way Emma's expression never faltered. "Ah," she always nodded. "Did I say something funny?" She was far too secure to need an explanation, so the whole thing was diffused without denying anybody a good time. The mental picture I have of her sitting perched on the big desk, so still, all the animation in the eyes and lips, was a permanent reproach when I too became a teacher of French, guilty of terrible self-doubt and regular overreaction. And to have enjoyed a fraction of her sense of security, to have gone on giving on such a scale. Evening classes in French for Bolton's unemployed in the 1930s might seem to be stretching it a bit. And yet they turned up, the cotton spinners and the miners, and later wrote to her in a kind of French, as did merchant seamen who'd enrolled in the College of the Sea. Their exercises arrived on Emma's doormat in envelopes with exotic stamps, and were returned corrected, together with a lengthy postscript of encouragement. She would never just write VG or could do better. I wouldn't want anybody to think Emma wasn't bracing at times. You got a mental or a spiritual kick up the arse when you needed it. During my second year at Cambridge, my call-up date to His Majesty's forces was suddenly deferred by 6 months. I panicked because I had expected to escape the May exams, so hadn't really been working. There had seemed no point. In imagination, I saw my exam result published in Emma's copy of the Times. J.G. Banks, Class 3. Or worse. But when I poured it all out to Emma, she said, "Banks, war alters people's lives in a myriad ways, some of them very minor. Now, mon vieux, take you these 3 learned tomes," selecting them from her shelves, "and digest them. You'll have a good second class at least." And so I did. After war service, I returned to Cambridge in November 1945 for my final year. As soon as the Christmas vacation arrived, I attended the school's annual carol service. And there was Emma, as ever, among the altos. Afterwards, she came towards me, smiling and nodding, but didn't stop. Had I offended her? I wondered uneasily. But this was my first Christmas at home since demob, and my family now claimed me. Before I knew it, I was back at college for the next term, without once having visited Emma. But there would be the Easter vacation in a couple of months, and in the meantime, I would write. I needed to say a few things. That was the week she died. Anyway, I've written it now. Some of it. That was how I discovered my air gun, wrapped in brown paper under the sofa. As soon as I tore the wrapping off, I was mad to start shooting. But it wasn't that simple. Dad had been a sergeant instructor with the 1st Army Rifle Training School, and he wanted to shoot off a lot of information before he'd let me touch the thing. It was counterproductive. I was so bemused by his technical patter that when I finally got hold of the gun, I trapped my finger in the breech. I still have the mark to show. The following year, Dad was just the same over my new Hornby train set, with a lot less excuse. Anyway, I'd been mentioned on the wireless. For what it was worth. In those days, the BBC was a very recent thing, and not to be compared with the local paper. Whenever Dad picked up the Bolton Evening News and said, "I'll just consult England's Guide," he was only half joking, if that. And now he was pointing to my name in print. "You've gone and won a foundation scholarship to Bolton School," he told me. His enthusiasm evidently knew bounds, and so did mine. We're good at that in my family. Go easy on the euphoria till you know what it's going to cost. And for a start, I was afraid that my award would crack no flags in Back Raymond Street. A few lads in the gang had said that Bolton School was a snob factory. Some of the pupils there paid to get in. I also knew that the other 3 11-plus candidates in the gang had opted to go to a different grammar school if they passed, and I was wondering if I would ever see them again. Another thing bothering me was the word foundation, which I'd only ever come across on Sundays in the congregational hymnal. Whatever a foundation was, the church evidently had one, because there was one particular hymn that said so. I'd always had an idea it was the pews you had to sit on. What that had to do with my scholarship to Bolton School, I looked at my father for guidance. He was saying that I had done well. He'd actually taken the pipe out of his mouth for once. I was mortified. I didn't let on to the gang until one of them asked me point blank, and when I owned up, it wasn't anything like as bad as I'd thought. Sam had failed the 11-plus 2 years earlier. He just nodded and said, sort of fatalistically, that, well, I was bright, wasn't I? There was a lot of 11-plus resignation about. Even in the 1950s, when I was a teacher, I met parents who would say, "You don't need to tell us, Mr. Banks. She's none our Karen, isn't she? I were none and all at school. So were her mother. Wasn't you, love?" But they looked quite comfortably off, and they evidently didn't feel that numbness had held them back. Sam's younger brother Arnold had also failed. He had an unforgiving eye and a sharp tongue, and I was especially uneasy about his reaction. But to my great surprise, he said, "You jammy little bugger. I'd give me back teeth to go there." Arnold surprised me again years later when he turned very religious and registered as a conscientious objector in the war. He joined the Merchant Navy as a non-combatant. My mother kept the cutting from the paper for me to read when I came home on leave. His ship had gone down. Arnold had died at sea. In the summer of 1932, almost inevitably, I turned towards new companions. At our front gate, to my mother's relief, I began to veer to the left. The bonds we form in early childhood are born of convenience, which leaves them mercifully slack. Like little Norma Nuttall, the Raymond Street connection faded as though it had never been. The only member of the gang I ever really came across again was my namesake, Derek, who went on to marry the daughter of a prominent town centre jeweller. In his new capacity, 30 years later, he sold me a couple of classy little items for my wife. Before the gang departs from my story for good, though, there are a couple of memories which could well be called shirt tales. The standard garment of those days was an unlovely article reaching almost to the knees. Long shirt tails had their uses. For instance, coal miners, I was told, wrapped them meticulously around their nether region because it was a well-known fact that, like sand at the seaside, sodding coal dust got everywhere. Unlikely as it may seem, the done thing was to wear your braces underneath your shirt, on top of your woolen vest. Your mother would make eye holes in the shirt at waist level so that you could thread the ends of your braces through these eye holes and then latch them onto the trouser buttons on the outside. It was a cumbersome setup, and after a few minutes kickabout in the schoolyard, the shirt would ride up remorselessly towards your armpits. But I would far rather have put up with that than my mother's alternative, which was to cut off both shirt tails and insert an elastic waistband instead. I was mortified. After all, the standard insult that you howled at sissies was, "You big girl's blouse." I was desperate not to be detected, but Derek's mother was equally determined to find out why my shirts always looked so much neater. Why didn't they ever gravitate towards my armpits? I tried to put her off, but one day she cornered me in her scullery up against the mangle and discovered my secret. No eye holes and no shirt tails. Just elastic. The word was put about, and soon one or two more girls' blouses appeared on Back Raymond Street, which let me in for a spot of aggro from the wearers who felt they'd been castrated. Still, things calmed down eventually, which was lucky for me. I could have developed a Delilah complex. It was ironic, really, that just at this time, having got the scholarship, I found I now had a bit more leverage at home. Mum bought me a belt to keep my kecks up, my shirts grew tails again, and my virility was redeemed. My second shirt tale concerns Sam and Arnold Baker. I had to call at their house one evening to collect a pullover I'd left behind in the street, which they were keeping safe for me. It was later than we normally met, so when their sister led me into the kitchen, I caught them with their trousers down. Literally. They were both in their blue striped shirts, which nearly came down to their knees, standing together meekly on the slopstone beside the kitchen sink, while the phlegmatic Mrs. Baker scrubbed their legs. They didn't know where to look when I came in. I thought, well, if there's a big girl's blouse in this room, it isn't me. Flippin' heck, at least I wash my own legs. I collected my pullover and went home, walking tall. The other major event before I began at Bolton School, a whole year before in fact, had come as a bombshell. Despite being a foundation scholar who'd recently been apprised of the facts of life, I completely failed to spot that my mum was pregnant. I never once thought, hello, she's looking jolly tubby these days. Wonder if she'll have another of those shocks and land up in bed for a month. And when Nurse Potter appeared on the doorstep again, the penny still didn't drop. Facts of life? I couldn't see the life for the facts. The good thing was that I got an extra week's holiday out of it. Grandpa Tomlins and Aunt Nora suddenly whisked me and Jean off to Southport. While I was there, I learnt to ride a bike at 6p an hour. I don't know what Jean did. Grandpa, why didn't Mum and Dad come with us? Because the tram's past the market. I was taken off to the cinema to get my mind off the subject. I did that all right. Harold Lloyd, the hero, landed himself in such a desperate situation up on the roof of a New York skyscraper that it really got to me. Quite unaware of what I was doing, I lifted both feet onto the seat and began rocking the entire row so hard that the manager came over and had a word with Grandpa. But I couldn't stop. I ended up standing in the aisle. As soon as we arrived back at Harper's Lane the following week, I was waylaid by Nurse Potter in the kitchen. "There's a big surprise waiting upstairs for you, Geoffrey," she said. "You've got another little baby sister. She's called Sheila. Isn't that lovely?" My reaction was also a big surprise, especially to me. No wonder I'd been shoved off to Southport, so they could keep it a secret. No wonder Grandpa's trams kept whizzing past the market. "Oh?" I said to Nurse Potter, in a tight sort of voice, which was a new one to me. Then I brushed past her on my way to the front gate. I had to get to Back Raymond Street to report in. I felt none of the interest or pleasure I'd experienced when Jean was born. It had been spoiled for me this time, because now I had the facts of life. And on top of that, I had been faced with an extra fact of life which Sam hadn't somehow made clear. Namely, that my parents too were involved in all this physics and biology. It would be a while before I digested that. When hunger eventually drove me home, I was met by Aunt Nora and taken into the front room. So it was serious. Grandpa had gone to ground, and Dad was out of the way, as usual, teaching night school. Nora bent my ear about Mum's postnatal shock, and the way I just augmented it. To get away from her, I agreed to go upstairs and gawp. I could see that my mother had her face on. She didn't say much beyond, "Hello, had a nice time at Southport?" I expect she thought it was disgraceful of me, that I had no right, that I ought to be reported. The baby glared at me, but it was probably wind. I thought it looked average. Mum said, "Just think, she was born practically on the same day as Princess Margaret." Unsurprisingly, the Queen had been first past the post by a neck. After the inevitable settling-in period at Bolton School, I was soon taking advantage of many of the extracurricular activities available. The Choral Society, the Dramatic Society, the Scout Troop, numerous sports, and others. Renaissance Kid. My zeal was noted on my school reports. I had become a chap. My father viewed the range of my activities with his predictable calmness, not even removing his pipe to pronounce that a really first-class team can only afford one all-rounder. However, the school's policy was to fling a lot of mud at its pupils in the belief that some will stick. And when I examine what adhered in my own case, I first have to acknowledge with gratitude the opportunity given me of performing solo as a boy soprano on 8 occasions in a large hall before a very large audience, and thus overcoming serious stage fright at an early age. I must also pay tribute to the dynamism of my music teacher, Noel McAdam, who grafted a very workmanlike technique upon my total ignorance. Correct breathing, where to aim the voice, and the northern sounds to eliminate. McAdam, known as Tarmac, of course, behind his back, was no specialist, but rather more of a science graduate with an immense enthusiasm for music. When I later became a tenor soloist at my Cambridge college, I was grateful for what I had learned from him, and I borrowed heavily from that knowledge in my early attempts as an actor. I had picked up precious little vocal technique from successive directors of the school play, who were too preoccupied with the logistics of grouping schoolboys in tights to find time for the niceties. As the youngest boy in my class, I became mortified to be the only one still wearing short trousers. For pre-war generations, the graduation to longs was as urgent as the arrival of body hair, and from about the age of 12, boys entreated their mother to be allowed to cover their kneecaps. My mother, sensibly, and of course sentimentally, tried to prolong my childhood and refused. I was, after all, among the smallest in the class, and anyway, my voice showed no signs of breaking. Eventually, I even begged McAdam to replace me as the soloist, but he had a keen interest in prolonging my career, as there was no obvious successor to me that year. Furthermore, like my mother, he drew the line at long-trousered sopranos. The advice of schoolmates proved useless. Nicotine wouldn't do the trick. I still remember the blood rising to my face when I asked the tobacconist for my first packet of 10 cigarettes. When, on the very eve of the carol service, my voice did finally produce a tiny uncertainty, I raced eagerly to demonstrate it to McAdam, but the phenomenon refused to repeat itself. "I'm sorry," said my taskmaster, "but you will sing the solo tomorrow. I am adamant." When I reported this glumly to my friend Harold Haslam, he vainly tried to cheer me up by chanting, "McAdamant!" and even, "Tar McAdamant!" As things turned out, though, I enjoyed myself at that carol service, especially Tarmac's expression when my piping soprano quavered in mid-solo and suddenly produced an unseemly honk. And behind me, the choir had a close-up view of their conductor's silent anguish as the honking soloist's expression became ecstatic. A vestigial amount of Boy Scouting rubbed off on me, but by no means as much as my scoutmaster would have wished. I was an active member of the scout troop for 4 years and found much to enjoy, but above all, it enabled me to become emotionally attached to the countryside, without turning into either a peasant or a Greenwelly man. It introduced me early to the delights of Somerset, the New Forest, and the Lake District, where I now live. But beyond that, and the usual companionship of one's fellows, well, it gave me the reef knot, which I use unremittingly in the garden, and the clove hitch, the bowline, and the sheepshank, which I do not. It schooled me in the less aesthetic uses of canvas, which I have subsequently avoided, along with barbecues. But I cannot claim even now to be cured of the expectation that each minor achievement be acknowledged with a badge. When I reached the sixth form, I probably thought with arrogance typical of that status that I had outgrown the Scouts. But when I ceased to attend the weekly meetings, there was a residual feeling of guilt that I had bitten the hand, or one of the hands, that had fed me. A feeling which expressed itself subconsciously in later years whenever I bumped into my long-suffering scoutmaster. Like a dedicated scout, when shaking hands with another scout, he always offered his left, and I always got it wrong.
Cottoning On by Geoffrey Banks, read by Nigel Banks. All music and studio recording by Robert Burgess. And this was an Old Dolly production.